They laughed at the old crane operator. But when the cartel attacked, they realized they were locked in with a deadly secret. He traded his sniper rifle for a wrecking ball. And he never misses. At 6 a.m, the air over downtown Chicago tastes like diesel and wet cement. For Mac, sitting 180 feet in the air inside the glass cab of a Liebherr tower crane, it was the only peace he ever got. The city was a sprawling grid of gray and steel below him, a chessboard that he observed with the detached, icy stare of a hawk. He adjusted the brim of his faded union cap, his knuckles white as he gripped the joysticks. The radio on his dashboard crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Yo, check out Grandpa," a voice sneered over the comms. It was Miller, the 20-something foreman on the ground. "Hey Mac, try not to fall asleep up there today. We actually need this rebar before lunch." Laughter erupted on the channel. Mac didn't respond. He just rubbed his left knee, the one that clicked and burned whenever the barometric pressure dropped. That knee was a souvenir from a rooftop in Fallujah, a jagged reminder of a life he had buried deep under layers of sawdust and silence. To the crew, he was just the gimp who walked funny and ate his ham sandwiches alone. They saw the limp. They didn't see the discipline. They didn't see that Mac checked his load charts 3 times before they even punched in, or that his eyes were constantly scanning the perimeter, a habit that never truly went away. The wind was picking up, gusting at 20 miles per hour off the lake. The crane swayed gently, a motion that would make a rookie vomit, but Mac moved with it. He was part of the machine. He lowered the hook with the grace of a surgeon, watching the cable tension. He wasn't just moving materials. He was managing energy. The young guys down there thought this was just heavy lifting. Mac knew it was physics. Every swing, every lift, every stop was a calculation of mass and inertia. He was invisible to them, just a gear in the mechanism of the skyline. But that invisibility was about to become his greatest weapon. The shift changed from boredom to terror in the span of a single heartbeat. From his vantage point in the sky, Mac saw them before anyone else. 3 black SUVs tore through the chain-link perimeter fence, kicking up clouds of gravel and dust. They didn't park. They swarmed. 12 men spilled out, moving with a tactical fluidity that Mac recognized instantly. These weren't petty thieves looking for copper wire. They were pros. They wore plate carriers, balaclavas, and carried suppressed carbines. "Miller, you've got hostiles at the north gate," Mac said into the radio. His voice was flat, devoid of panic. "Shut up, old man, I'm trying to." Miller's voice cut off with a scream. Mac watched through the floor window of his cab as the intruders pistol-whipped Miller and forced the ground crew onto their knees. The site went silent, save for the terrified shouts of the workers. The leader of the hit squad, a man in a tan tactical jacket, pointed toward the unfinished elevator shaft. They weren't here for the tools. They were here for the vantage point. The construction site offered a direct line of sight to the federal courthouse across the street, where a high-profile witness was due to arrive in less than an hour. The realization hit Mac like a physical blow. The construction site was the perfect sniper's nest, and his crane was the ultimate observation post. He watched as 2 of the gunmen broke off from the main group and headed for the tower ladder. They were coming up. They were coming for him. The young workers below were zip-tied and helpless, huddled behind pallets of drywall. Panic began to ripple through the site, but 50 meters up, Mac's heart rate slowed down. The fear vanished, replaced by the cold, familiar clarity of the mission. The crane operator was gone. The sniper had clocked back in. Mac locked the cabin door, a futile gesture against military-grade hardware, but it bought him seconds. He looked at the control panel. To anyone else, it was just levers and gauges. To Mac, it was an arsenal. He wasn't armed with a .50 caliber rifle anymore, but he was sitting inside a weapon that weighed 200 tons and could generate enough torque to rip a tank in half. He needed to change his perspective. He stopped looking at the construction materials as supplies and started seeing them as ballistics. Internal monologue, standard pallet of bricks, 3,500 pounds. Terminal velocity from this height, roughly 70 miles per hour. Impact force, enough to turn a sedan into a pancake. The acetylene tanks on the 3rd deck? Incendiary devices. The high-tension steel cables? whips capable of bisecting a human torso. He analyzed the crane's load moment indicator. The jib length was 60 meters. The trolley speed maxed out at 100 meters per minute. He checked the wind speed again. 22 miles per hour, north-northwest. He wasn't just calculating lift anymore. He was calculating kill zones. The two gunmen climbing the tower ladder were moving fast, their boots clanging rhythmically against the metal rungs. They were about 80 feet below him and climbing. Mac scanned the deck below. He needed an equalizer. His eyes locked onto a suspended load of steel I-beams that had been left hovering near the fourth floor during the break. It was unsecured, swaying slightly in the wind. If he could manipulate the trolley, he could turn that passive load into a kinetic hammer. He didn't need bullets. He had gravity. And gravity never missed, provided you did the math right. He switched the crane from eco to performance mode, overriding the safety limiters. The electric motors hummed with a deeper, more aggressive pitch. The beast was awake. Mac knew he couldn't stay in the cab forever. It was a glass coffin. He needed to blind them and slow their ascent. He grabbed a heavy wrench and a roll of electrical tape from his tool bag, then popped the emergency hatch in the roof of the cab. The wind roared louder out here, whipping his jacket around his frame. He crawled out onto the jib, the narrow metal walkway stretching out over the abyss. He wasn't running. He was hunting. He made his way to the main electrical junction box located just behind the slew ring, the gear that allowed the crane to rotate. If they reached the cab, they could use the crane to target the courthouse or drop debris on the police. He had to ensure that only he could control this monster. With a grunt of exertion, Mac smashed the lock off the junction box. He located the remote control receiver, the system that allowed the crane to be operated from the ground. He ripped the wires out, sparking and hissing. Now, the only way to move this bird was from the seat he just left. But he wasn't done. He looked down at the tower section. The climbers were getting closer. He could hear their radio chatter now. Mac crawled back toward the hydraulic lines that powered the climbing cage. He loosened the pressure valve just enough to leak fluid but not enough to fail completely. Then, he located the high-voltage cable running up the side of the tower structure. It powered the floodlights for the night shift. He used his insulated cutters to strip a section of the wire, leaving the live copper exposed right next to the handrail of the ladder. It was a crude, nasty trap, the kind you set when you were outnumbered 10-1. He scurried back into the cab, his bad leg screaming in protest, and locked the hatch just as the first hand grabbed the ladder rung 50 feet below. The first gunman reached the exposed wire. A scream tore through the air, followed by the sickening sound of a body hitting the safety netting 3 floors down. The trap had worked, but the second climber was smarter. He bypassed the trap and was now nearing the cab platform. Mac didn't wait. He grabbed the joysticks. "Let's dance," he whispered. He slammed the left joystick forward, engaging the slew gear. The massive crane arm began to rotate violently to the left. The sudden centrifugal force caused the entire tower to shudder. The gunman on the ladder lost his footing, clinging desperately to the rungs as the world spun around him. But Mac wasn't just shaking him off. He was lining up a shot. Hanging from the hook was a concrete bucket, empty but still weighing a solid ton. Mac coordinated his hands and eyes with terrifying precision. He slewed left, then suddenly jammed the stick right, creating a whip effect. The concrete bucket swung outward like a wrecking ball. It smashed into the side of the building structure where a group of the gunmen had set up a heavy machine gun nest on the 10th floor. Crunch. The sound of metal on concrete was deafening. The bucket pulverized the scaffolding, sending the gunmen and their weapon tumbling into the debris pile below. It was a brutal display of industrial force. The gunmen on the ground opened fire on the cab. Bullets spider-webbed the reinforced glass. Mac ducked, curling into a ball on the floor of the cab, steering the crane by feel and memory. He was playing a video game of death, and he just cleared level 1. The element of surprise was gone. The villains knew the threat wasn't the police. It was the old man in the sky. The leader screamed orders into his radio, and the remaining shooters shifted their focus entirely to the crane. It became a siege. Bullets pinged off the steel structure like hail, sparking against the machinery. The glass of the cab was shattered, forcing Mac to wear his safety goggles to keep the shards out of his eyes. He was pinned down. He couldn't stand up, and he couldn't see clearly through the ruined windows. The sight below had become a labyrinth of danger. The villains were using the unfinished floors as cover, moving up through the internal stairwells where the crane couldn't reach them. They were flanking him. "Think, Mac, think," he muttered, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. He checked his monitors. The cameras on the winch were still active. He had eyes, even if he couldn't use the windows. He watched on the grainy black-and-white screen as the tactical team breached the 20th floor. They were getting too high. If they reached the roof, they'd have a straight shot into the cab. He needed to change the battlefield. He couldn't fight them man-to-man. He had to fight them environment to environment. He needed to make the building itself hostile. He scanned the load chart again. There was a pallet of drywall sheets sitting on the edge of the 22nd floor, right above where the team was advancing. If he could nudge it just a little, he could create an avalanche. But the hook was too low. He had to hoist, swing, and drop the hook with pinpoint accuracy to snag the pallet straps without anyone seeing it coming. He was blind firing a cannon. Mac took a deep breath, slowing his heart rate to 60 beats per minute. This was the math of survival. He visualized the vector. The hook was currently at coordinate x 15, y 30 relative to the tower. The pallet was at x 20, y 35. He needed to induce a pendulum swing. Internal monologue. Period of oscillation equals 2 pi times the square root of length over gravity. If I drop the cable length to 40 meters, the swing time is roughly 12 seconds. I need to catch the backswing at exactly 6 seconds to maximize the kinetic energy. He wasn't just dropping a hook. He was calculating harmonic motion. He closed his eyes for a second, feeling the vibration of the motor. He feathered the hoist lever. The massive hook block dipped, swung away from the tower, paused at the apex of the arc, and then came rushing back. Mac timed it perfectly. As the hook swung inward toward the 22nd floor, he slewed the crane slightly to the right to match the angle of the building. The heavy steel block slammed into the stack of drywall. It wasn't an explosion. It was physics in action. The force transferred through the stack, breaking the friction holding it in place. 2 tons of gypsum board slid off the edge of the slab. It didn't fall straight down. It planed through the air, shattering into a massive white cloud of choking dust that filled the 20th and 21st floors. The ventilation shafts sucked the dust in, blinding the tactical team instantly. It was a chemical weapon without the chemicals, just particulate matter and gravity. The coughing and confusion over the radio told Mac he had bought himself another 5 minutes. But he knew the endgame was approaching. The police sirens were wailing now, a symphony of red and blue lights flooding the street below. But they were stuck. The cartel leader had ordered a heavy truck parked across the main entrance, and his men were using it as a barricade to pin down the arriving SWAT team. The police were trapped in a fatal funnel, taking heavy fire from the lobby. They couldn't breach. They were sitting ducks. Mac saw the standoff on his monitor. He saw the police taking hits. He looked at his load block. It was empty. He needed a projectile. He needed the big one. Sitting on the far side of the site, waiting for placement, was a precast concrete stormwater culvert. A solid block of reinforced concrete, cube-shaped, weighing exactly 8,000 pounds. It was 50 meters away from the gate. Mac throttled the crane to maximum. The cables groaned as he dragged the hook over to the block. He didn't have time to rig it properly. He used the hook to snag the rebar loops on top. He hoisted it up, the engine screaming under the sudden load. The crane bowed, the steel structure flexing. "Hang on, old girl," Mac gritted out. He swung the massive block over the gap between the buildings. He looked down. The cartel truck was a tiny rectangle. The police were pinned. The villains were confident. Mac lined up the shot. He had to drop it precisely in front of the police but on top of the villain's firing line. A margin of error of millimeters. If he missed by a foot, he kills a cop. If he misses the other way, the villains survive. He factored in the wind. He factored in the delay of the release mechanism. He watched the sway. He waited for the stillness between breaths. "Package for you," Mac whispered. He hit the quick release. For a second there was no sound. The 4-ton concrete block plummeted, a gray blur against the sky. It fell for 3 seconds, accelerating to over 100 kilometers per hour. Boom! The impact felt like an earthquake. The block smashed into the pavement exactly between the SWAT team and the cartel gunmen, crushing the front end of the blockade truck and sending a shockwave that knocked every standing man to the ground. The asphalt shattered, creating a massive crater. Dust and debris erupted like a volcano. The villains were stunned, their cover decimated, their eardrums ruptured by the overpressure. The SWAT team, realizing the miracle that had just occurred, surged forward through the cloud. With the suppressive fire silenced by the hand of God, or the hand of Mac, the police breached the perimeter. Flashbangs went off. Shouts of "Federal agents! Get down!" echoed through the site. From his high tower, Mac watched the chaos resolve into order. He saw the bad guys being dragged out in cuffs. He saw the police captain looking up at the crane, shielding his eyes from the sun, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. The precision was impossible. It shouldn't have been possible. The block had landed with the accuracy of a laser-guided missile. Mac slumped back in his seat, the adrenaline finally crashing. His hands shook uncontrollably. The radio clicked. "Crane operator. This is Sergeant Miller with SWAT," a voice crackled, filled with awe. "Identify yourself." "Over." Mac looked at the radio. He didn't answer. He just reached for his thermos and poured the last of his lukewarm coffee. The sun was setting by the time the site was cleared. Mac brought the hook up and parked the crane in the weather vane position, allowing it to spin freely in the wind for the night. He grabbed his lunchbox and began the long, painful climb down the tower ladder. When his boots hit the dirt, the scene was different. The mockery was gone. The young ground crew, Kyle, Brad, the ones who called him Grandpa, were standing there. They were covered in dust, shaken, but safe. As Mac limped toward the exit gate, the silence was heavy. Kyle stepped forward. He looked at the crater where the concrete block sat, perfectly positioned, then back at the old man with the bad knee. He didn't say a word. He just took his hard hat off and held it against his chest. One by one, the other workers did the same. The SWAT commander nodded at Mac as he passed, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. Mac didn't stop for interviews. He didn't tell them about his medals or the sniper school in Quantico. He just walked to his rusted Ford pickup, tossed his gear in the back, and cranked the engine. They thought he was just a laborer. They thought he was broken. But as he drove away, fading into the city traffic, the crew knew the truth. They hadn't been saved by a crane. They were saved by the blue-collar genius. And somewhere, 50 meters up in the sky, the ghost of the sniper finally clocked out.